Okay, so today we're going to be talking about what to do when your boundaries are violated. This is important for us because when we set a boundary, we feel like, okay, this is supposed to keep us safe. But then if someone were to just go and violate that boundary, it can really just shatter us. It can shatter our whole perception of what boundaries are and what they're going to do for us because we're relying on boundaries really to keep us safe. We're relying on boundaries really to help us to feel a sense of self and to feel like there's a differentiation between us and the other person. And so it's absolutely essential that we're able to not only set boundaries and not only assert the boundaries, but to enforce them, to know what to do when we're unable to, or when the boundary seems to get completely mowed over by someone. So maybe you've had an experience like that, where you feel like, okay, I set the boundary, I did what I was supposed to do, I've done the work, I've learned about how to set boundaries, but in all my efforts, it all failed. The boundaries just didn't work. And it may feel that way because when you set the boundary up, you have professional boundary crossers who go by names such as narcissists and psychopaths and sociopaths, and they come into our life. And as soon as you try to assert something, that's like their signal to just go and mow that boundary right down. And that can leave us feeling very discouraged. And we can be feeling like, my goodness, if I set up boundaries and these boundaries can just easily get mowed down, then maybe there's no point on setting up boundaries. For many, it can leave them traumatized. It can leave them feeling like boundaries don't work, so the only thing that they can do is become avoidant of all people. I was able to take care of it, Brooke, no worries. So some people may become jaded as a result. They've tried to set boundaries. They've tried to keep those boundaries in place. But as a result of their best efforts, they feel like people aren't going to respect their boundaries. So they may feel like, well, what's the point? What am I supposed to do since all my best efforts just don't work? Some people give in. They try to set the boundary. They had all the best intentions. They thought they were more healed, but then the boundary crossers come in and they put so much pressure on you that you just feel like, you know what, it would just be easier to just give in. They become so ugly, so mean, that you feel like, you know what, trying to uphold these boundaries just isn't worth it anymore. So what do we do when we've set the boundary, we've asserted the boundary, but someone still crosses our boundary? If you remember, I've used in teaching boundaries the analogy of a nation. In that we look at ourselves as a sovereign nation. Each one of us is in ourselves a sovereign nation. So when you look at yourself that way, then you recognize that you have the authority, but also the responsibility to take care of the self, to protect your resources like a nation does. So likewise, if you're a nation and you have borders, which would be pictured by boundaries in this illustration, what happens when someone tries to cross your borders? Specifically, the neighboring nation itself decides without your permission that they're going to send troops in, as if they're planning a takeover. What happens if your country gets invaded in quite a literal sense? Well, when a country gets invaded, it virtually automatically means war. Either that or the leader of the country would just have to surrender their country over. But when someone invades a country, it is automatically a declaration of war. So is there any way to be safe? As long as we live in a world where there are dictators, i.e. the sociopaths and psychopaths who are like the mass marauder bandits and the terrorists, and there are narcissists, as we call them, these people who are egopathic and lacking empathy, we will always be at war. It's very important to understand this. We need to update the old belief system. You cannot go into life with a naive belief system such as, well, everybody can get along. No, they can't. Not in this world. Well, if I set boundaries, people will respect them. No, they won't. Not everyone. Well, it should be enough. I should be able to get a decent amount of respect from anyone if I were to assert myself. It's just not the world we live in. The world we live in is one where people survive on crossing other people's boundaries and violating them and taking from them and taking what belongs to them. So we must recognize the world we live in. We will be at war. We are always at war. Do you recognize that? It's a reality and it's an updated belief system. See, if we have that belief system, we're less likely to be traumatized when a boundary gets violated. If we go into life day to day realizing, hey, I'm always potentially on the brink of war, then when someone mows down our boundary, we're less likely to feel broken. Why? Because our belief system was such that it was sophisticated for the world that we actually live in. When you understand that we're not all going to get along and it's not all going to go perfect and we're not all going to have that perfect family life. And just because we're related by blood doesn't mean that all of us are going to be able to get along and it's all supposed to work nicely. When we understand that that is not reality, then we're not going to be surprised when we set a boundary and it is not respected. That is just a part of the world that we live in. So now, what are our options? When we set boundaries and the violator just keeps on violating. Well, for one, remember, ideologically, you must recognize that this is expected. That's what they are. They're boundary violators. They are evil dictators. They will invade your country. And when you set up a border and you say, hey, I just like to let you know, this is the border of my country, they're going to say, all right, let me get my toe and just stick it right over that line. So now what do we do? Now that we got our ideology straight and we're coming in with the right philosophy, we understand we're always at war. How can a nation handle it when they're getting invaded? There's basically three main categories of response that a nation can take. They can give warnings, they can impose sanctions, and they can use force. A nation can give warnings, they can impose sanctions, and they can use force. You are your own little sovereign nation, the island of Roman, or the island of Charlotte, or the island of or the country of Lo, right? So we as individuals have to think in terms of, okay, how am I gonna protect my borders when I get invaded? It's a win, not an if. It's an inevitability in the world that we live in. As soon as you tell someone where the boundary is, they're going to try to cross it. Just like the nations, we have to either give a warning, impose sanctions, or we gotta use force. Those are the options at your disposal. It is that simple. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down how this really works here, because when we talk about giving warnings, what we're talking about in terms of us in the energy realm is reasserting our boundary. When we talk about imposing sanctions, what we're saying is that you have the ability to remove yourself or remove access to your resources from those boundary crossers. And when we talk about using force, well, there's a couple different ways that we can use actual force to enforce our boundaries. And we're gonna go into detail right now. So after this instructional, you're going to be ready. You'll be prepared to handle the inevitability that people are not going to respect your boundaries. Your first option, warnings. This is reasserting your boundary. The first thing that you should try to do when a boundary gets crossed is try reasserting your boundary. We cannot do this in all cases, first of all, but many times you can, because not all people are psychopathic, egopathic, narcissistic, terrorists, or dictators, right? Some people, and by the way, I'm talking about your family. I'm talking about the people that live in your household, your mother, your brothers, your sister, your wife, your boyfriend, your cousins. So when I use these harsh terms, I'm talking about the people who are close to you, because those are the people who really love to violate the boundaries. But we have to understand, in all cases, just reasserting the boundary is not always going to be possible, but sometimes it is, because some people are not necessarily evil. Some people are just normal folks who they'll take what you give them. So they've crossed your boundaries because you don't set up clear boundaries and enforce them. But when you set up clear boundaries and enforce them, they'll follow them. You see this demonstrated in the world we live in. Most people tend to follow the laws, especially if they feel those laws will be enforced. And that's how it is in the energy realm as well. Most people will respect your boundaries, especially if they believe that you will enforce those boundaries and they've seen from experience that you will. So sometimes the first thing we have to do is reassert the boundary. So what is reasserting the boundary? Well, reassert means to assert again. Asserting is to what? State a fact. So in order to reassert, we have to state the fact again. This could look many different ways. So let's say you've told someone not to touch you, then they touch you again. So you may just decide, I'm going to reassert this boundary. And you turn around and you say, I asked you not to touch me. Please do not do that again. We may find that in reasserting our boundary, in restating the fact, we may have to become increasingly firm, right? So imagine a gentleman who's married, but he's got someone at work who's flirting with him inappropriately. First time, it might just be kind of nice and play shy. But it is his responsibility to reassert the boundary. He may have to be more firm with the person who's flirting with him to make sure that she understands this is not okay. So he may have to come back this next time and say, that's not appropriate for work. Please don't talk like that to me. Then if this person does it again, he may have to be more firm. In this case, the man may assume that this woman is not evil, but she just maybe doesn't understand. With that assumption, he comes back more firm than before. Excuse me, ma'am. I told you I am married. I'm not interested in you. If you do this again, I will report you to HR. Bam. Firm, reassertion, clear, plain as day. Are we supposed to talk like that to people? You better. Wake up to the world you live in. Isn't that mean? It's better to be mean than to have your boundaries crossed, violated, and all of your resources plundered and stolen. So if you interpret that as being mean, then okay, it's however you interpret it. You see, you are the king or the queen. So you actually decide what is an acceptable display of assertiveness. Am I being balanced? Am I being mean? Did I do it kindly enough? Was I tactful enough? You are the determiner of that. You are the authority of that, because you're the one who has to sleep with the way that you handle yourself at night. Other people will say to you, you're not nice. You're so mean, right? Likely this young lady could gaslight the men and say, what are you talking about? I never said anything to you. You're just blah, 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 right? It doesn't matter what other people say. Put that in your notes. It doesn't matter how they respond. We don't control that. Setting boundaries is not about controlling other people. Setting boundaries is about letting people know where the borderline is. Here's the border. You just crossed it. I'm letting you know. If it happens again, there will be enforcement. Is this making sense? In order to exist in the world and to be able to be happy, to be able to be kind and friendly, to be able to be relaxed, to have the romance and the friendship, we have to be good at this. This is what we're missing. When we're afraid, like, oh, I don't want to go out there. I can't deal with people. They take too much from me. That's because we haven't built these skills right here. The ability to speak up, to not worry about if you're coming off as mean, but worry about asserting the boundary and doing it in a way that's balanced, not aggressive, not passive, right in the middle. We got to get the point across, and we can do it in a way that cares for the other person's feelings as well. That's what assertiveness skills are. Sometimes it's even appropriate to raise one's voice. Especially, it would be appropriate if you are, in a sense, the weaker party in the violation. For instance, imagine a woman that is in a public setting and a man continues to violate her personal space and she's touching her. And she says nicely, oh, excuse me, can you please not do that? Please don't touch me. And a few minutes later, he does it again. And so she tries to be more firm. She says, hey, stop touching me, please. Don't do that. Now, what happens? The man does it again. It could be appropriate in this scenario because she's perceived as being lower in power to actually raise her voice and say, excuse me, I said don't touch me. Why might that be a good approach? Well, now this is alerting all of the neighboring nations, all of those other people who are around, that someone over here it may be violating a boundary. And so she's enlisting her allies. This is appropriate. This is appropriate. But we need to be careful. It's not always appropriate to raise one's voice, especially if we're perceived as being more powerful. So now you picture a big man talking to a young child, but he's raising his voice. That may not be appropriate. It may be better to speak in a calm, assertive, but peaceful, level manner, right? So we have to understand that it's different in every scenario. So you have to analyze the scenario you're in and decide which tools you're going to pull out. This is where personal power and intelligence comes in. It's not just about being ethical and compassionate. You need all four, EPIC. You're the queen. You are the authority figure. Sit in your throne and decide, here's how I'm going to handle it, and I'm going to live with that. Because I believe that's the best way I can handle it in this situation. Does this require us to be unemotional? You bet. This is not an exercise in the feels. You have to be aware of how you're feeling so that you know that it's time to assert a boundary, but you should not be acting on feelings or showing feelings. This is about protection. This is a technical procedure. Just like if you are a president or a king of a country, right? You don't respond emotionally to another country trying to invade, do you? No, you simply state the facts, you assert the warning, and so on. And if necessary, you impose sanctions or use force, which we're about to get into. Before we do, one of the main ways that we can reassert our boundaries is by using the art of negotiation. Most of the time, we can call people to the table, set up an actual appointment, and inform them through a calm conversation. Listen, I called you here because there's something you're doing that's been bothering me. If we recognize that we're dealing with a person that may not be an abuser, they may just be a fellow human who doesn't get it, who doesn't understand, we want to give them that benefit of the doubt, sit down, have a negotiation, have a conversation, right? This is the same way countries handle conflict, right? You can do diplomatic relations in some cases. So sit down and try to handle it with diplomacy. All the same rules apply. You allow them to share their side. You will make sure you get to share what it is that you have to say. You can do so in a way that saves face. Let them know, hey, you know, I love you. I appreciate the progress you've been making. There is one thing that's bothering me, and I just want to make you aware of it to empower you. Use your language, right? Be kind. Allow them to save face. Life is a negotiation. We got to negotiate for our space. So understand that you can use words and you can speak to people. You can bring them to the table. You can have conversations. Oh, but I'm scared. That's feels. Get out of the feels. Let's get into the intellect, the wisdom. Sit down and have conversations with people. Let them know where you stand, what they're doing that's bothering you, what you appreciate about them. We can be kind. And we're doing this why? We want to set them up for success. We actually want the success. This is how we're able to maintain good relationships. People who aren't afraid to connect, who aren't avoidant, who aren't running away, it's because they believe they can have good relationships, and they believe that because they have the skills of knowing they can sit down, knowing they can express themselves, knowing they can negotiate for their space, knowing that they can speak up. This is making sense? It's beautiful. So how do we speak to people when we need to negotiate a situation? Make sure you're using all four qualities of the higher self, EPIC: ethics, personal power, intelligence, compassion. We don't want to be too aggressive and assertive, or too aggressive. We don't want to be too passive. So imagine the waiter brings me the wrong meal. The passive response, oh, wait, oh, it's fine. I'll just eat this meal that I didn't order. Don't do that. Right? Too passive. Aggressive response, I need to see the manager. I need to see. Too much. Don't do that. Right in the middle. It's right here. Assertiveness. Call the waiter back. Hey, I'm so sorry to bother. I don't mean to complain, but I think that this is not what I ordered. And I'm not sure if it was a mistake on my part, but I was trying to order the lobster and you brought me a bowl of soup, and I'm not sure if I did something wrong or if this is a part of the meal. Allow them to respond. Most people will say, oh, I'm so sorry. You know what? Let me take that back. Don't worry about it. This is on me. And then you can get into the niceness wars. No. I want to pay. No. It's my fault. No. This is where we want to be. This all happens by calling them to the table, having that assertiveness meeting. You're reasserting the boundary. You're letting them know, hey, I ordered something. You didn't give me what I wanted, but you're not doing it in a mean way. Now, what happens if they violate? What happens if they respond mean, our worst fear? They look at us and they say, oh my God, what are you talking about? That is what you ordered. What do we do then? We can simply reassert our boundary. Okay, maybe from your perspective, this is what I ordered, but from my memory, it wasn't. What can we do in order to resolve this? Assertiveness. Most people will say, okay, well, you know what? Let me just take this back and I'll get you what you ordered. Well, what if they don't? What if they violate? What if they get really mad at us? It's fine. No matter what, we're ultimately going to do one of two things. We're going to reassert our boundary, or we're going to enforce our boundary, right? So I can just reassert again. Well, you know, blah, 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 such and such. We may have to enforce. So it may then say, you know, I like to escalate this, right? Or I'm going to get up and walk away. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about if we're not reasserting and we are enforcing, we have these other two ways of handling things that a nation would do, which is imposing sanctions and using force. Likewise, for us, we have two things that we can do. We can walk away, which is imposing sanctions because we are limiting people's access to our resources at that point. Or we can use force, which we'll get into. So let's talk about imposing sanctions, which is walking away. Walk away. 90% of the time, we can just walk away as the best way to enforce our boundaries. This is the way, this is enforcing your boundary, right? So there's different ways of walking away. You can do the temporary silent removal of oneself from a situation, or you can communicate and let them know that you're removing yourself from the situation, right? So let's say your family invites you over for a big family gathering, and you show up and you got your adopted son that's a different race, then your weird immature mother is like, oh, you're going to need to tell people that that son is just a friend of your kids, because I don't want people thinking anything. And you're just like, what? Okay, now you've detected a violation of the boundary. How can we enforce that this person has violated our boundary? Temporary silent removal. Just look at your mom, straight face. Go get your kids, gather all your stuff, very calm, very slow, walk out of the house and leave. Just like that, without saying anything. That is an appropriate way to enforce your boundaries. We have to enforce our boundaries. It teaches people where the line is. There's no need to sit and have an argument or a conversation about this. She's going to know exactly why you left. It's because she's being ridiculous according to your rules and standards. And as we've learned, we get to set up those rules and standards. We decide. We can also let people know what it is that we're going to do. And sometimes that's appropriate. Imagine in a marriage, you're not dealing with an evil person, it's your spouse. But you notice that the conversation is not going anywhere, which is a violation of your boundaries because you don't want to be arguing. And so you just communicate that you're going to remove yourself, and you let your spouse know. I can see that we're both a little bit upset right now. I'd like to propose that we take a break from this conversation and then just come back in a certain amount of time when we're feeling a little bit better. Set a time limit to it. How about we do this in a couple hours? How about we link back up tonight after work? How about we do this in person rather than over text? How about we do this in text rather than in person, right? Change something, change an element, and you're at that point creating that assertion of the boundary. You're walking away, you're imposing a sanction, but it's not to punish them. It's to make sure that you're not further being violated by having a yelling match or something like that. If you ever notice yourself in an argument where you're yelling back and forth, you automatically know you need to shut everything down and end that conversation either permanently or temporarily. You should never be in a yelling match with anyone ever. Sometimes we have to take extreme measures of walking away, where we have to permanently leave a situation. We have to permanently leave our city, permanently leave our school, permanently leave our job, permanently leave our church, permanently block people. How do we know when to do what? You're the king, you're the queen, you decide. You decide when it's time to actually go as far as to do something permanent, and when you can just sit down and have some diplomatic conversations about the situation, or when you can just do a temporary removal. You decide, but make sure that you're not being extreme. We don't want to be over here over aggressive. We don't want to be over here overly passive. Right in the middle. Assertive. So that's how we enforce our boundary, through imposing sanctions. We get up and we walk away. This literally means gathering your belongings, removing yourself from the situation. Is it temporary? That's up to you. Are you going to let them know that what you're doing? That's up to you. Is it going to be permanent? All of that's up to you. You decide. You're the king or the queen. You're going to base it on the actual situation that you're dealing with. Because every situation is different, it's got to be a different reaction every time. So finally, let's talk about force. When a nation is attacked, sometimes leaders feel that they have no choice but to use force in defending themselves. Many of you will be, unfortunately, in situations where you feel there is no better option than to use force. You may feel that reasserting has not worked or is not going to work. Walking away has not worked or is not going to work or be possible. And you actually have to use force. There's two main types of force. There's contact force and there's non-contact force. And that's a scientific thing, but we can use that as an analogy for the energy realm as well. Contact force is where we actually use some type of physical altercation, even violence. This is very rarely going to be the case. You should not find yourself constantly in physically violent situations. If you do, it means that somewhere along the line, you're not setting boundaries way, way, way earlier and taking proper precautions, right? It should be very rare, like a once in a lifetime scenario where you find yourself having to use physical force. But sometimes it's necessary, particularly when you are under physical attack and you cannot walk away, you cannot run away. You may need to strike out in your own defense. Do not block off the part of yourself that has the ability to shut off a switch in your mind and to turn off that empathy for a moment in order to defend yourself. If you are being physically attacked and you're under some type of pressure and you have to strike out in defense in order for you to get the space to get away, then that's just what you have to do. And I trust you as the queen or the king of the self to recognize if you're actually in a situation that is that dire. And believe it or not, you're even protected by the law under certain scenarios. If you truly are in that situation, self-defense is excusable in most countries around the world, probably all. So we have to recognize that there are certain situations where it is appropriate for us to literally use force in order to keep ourselves safe. These situations, though, should be very, very, very rare. And yes, it should be tempered by your ethics, your analytical intelligence, and your compassion, because this is definitely not a way to live. You cannot live by excessive force, and a lot of people like to try to do that. That's wrong on every level. There's also non-contact force. In the energy realm, non-contact force is where we're not using our physical body to actually defend ourselves, but we need to use the force of the system. This would look like calling the police, filing a restraining order, going to court, involving authorities, involving the system itself to protect you. This is non-contact force. We have to use sometimes non-contact force, the system, to actually protect us. Now, it's important that we recognize the difference as a wise queen or king between trying to use the system as retribution or retaliation. Like, oh, I'm going to get him now for what he did. I'm going to get him thrown in jail. I'm going to get him exposed, or I'm going to make her lose her job. I wouldn't advocate that we utilize the system in that way. Boundaries are about defense. It's about just making sure that we keep ourselves and our resources safe. If you can recognize around you that your resources are relatively safe at the moment, then maybe it's not necessary for you to go the next step and to go into the system and to try to exact justice for a certain situation. But sometimes it's necessary, and that's why the system's there, and you can use it. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to fight back. And sometimes you got to fight back through the system. Sometimes you got to wage a war that takes months, years of patience, and just constantly moving forward, filing the paperwork to fight, to make sure that you are not further being violated. Reporting things in the workplace, going before HR. We need to do what's necessary. Use non-contact force sometimes to protect ourselves. It is our responsibility. So hopefully all of these have helped you to start to realize what you need to do when someone decides that they're going to mow over your boundary. We have to enforce our boundaries. The two main ways of enforcing your boundaries are either to reassert or to move forward with enforcement which is either walking away or using force. Again, like a nation, this is just like giving warnings, imposing sanctions, or using force. There are some situations that are just horrific. If you're under attack, you're being physically attacked by an entity that's stronger than you. Keep in mind that a person has the ability to violate your body. They can damage your body, but your soul can remain intact because people don't have access to that. You have to decide if you will allow your soul to be violated, which means that you will actually violate the soul. So if you are in a situation where someone is trying to assault you, understand that you have the option to resist and to continue resisting. This could produce some benefits. It could create a scenario where the attacker has to give up because you've won by law of attrition. It could create a scenario where this attacker, even if they're successful in completing their attack against you, could realize that they don't want to come back for more because you're just too difficult of a target. And what it could create for you is an ability to walk out less traumatized because you feel like through continuing to resist, you have kept your soul intact. You stood up for what you believed in. This could, of course, expose you to greater physical danger because that is the situation that you're being put in. The paradox of deciding between your physical safety and your inner values. It is up to you what you decide to do. But we should never judge someone for fawning as a result of a traumatic situation that they're in. Fawning is a survival approach. It is a response to allow a person to survive. We shouldn't judge them, and you shouldn't judge yourself for that. We shouldn't judge a person for fighting in a traumatic situation. We shouldn't judge a person for freezing, and don't judge yourself. But those are worst case scenarios. When you're going through your day-to-day life, most of the situations are not high level traumas like that. So utilize the skills that we've talked about today. And I encourage you to have an uncompromising spirit. Never cave under pressure, and teach these people what you're made of. Assert your boundaries.